All right, so thanks everybody for joining us again for our Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition Lunch and Learn series. And today we are really tackling the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity and the workforce hubs. And we are so privileged to have with us Angela Morrison from the Chicago Jobs Council, who is going to walk us through what's going on, what the next steps are, and just all of this exciting parts of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for her. But Angela, do you want to introduce yourself first, and then I will share screen because I know you might need to go off video.
Great. Thank you, Jen. Thanks so much for having me here today. Pleasure to be here with you all. My name is Angela Morrison, and I am the Policy Engagement Manager for the Chicago Jobs Council. And before we get started, I'd like to just give you an overview of who we are at the Jobs Council. So we're a 40-year-old entering our 41st year member-based organization. And our mission is to really help people move out of poverty through employment. And we do that by using on-the-ground expertise, which we collect and get from member organizations. We do advocacy, and we do capacity building. Our membership base is approximately 70 community-based organizations, civic groups, businesses, and even some individuals who are very committed to helping Chicagoans and Illinoisans who are excluded from the mainstream labor market. The Jobs Council, we act on the principle that effective public policy and service delivery is the result of broad community participation in creating a good dialogue with a diverse array of organizations. In the area of our policy work, we do that by advancing new policies such as the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, and advancing other policies through the legislative process, and also through administrative advocacy, which we'll touch a little bit on today. And the way that we describe administrative advocacy is seeking to influence the rules that government agencies might use to implement new laws. So think about it in terms of that. In addition to our policy work, we also build the capacity of the workforce development field. So those are those frontline direct service providers who work with the constituents and potentially program trainees or community members who are looking for workforce services. And our Frontline Focus Training Institute is the way that we deliver our capacity building services. And they deliver a series of trainings to help meet the needs of employment of job seekers, workers, and employers. And you can learn a lot more about us over at the Chicago Jobs Council at our website at cjc.net. I'd also just like to say CJC is a member of the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. Next slide.
Great, let me start sharing my screen. So 1 second.
Cool. Thank you. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, give you an overview of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, talk a little about the coalition, and then we're going to take a deeper dive into the workforce hubs, which my organization was really excited and really through the lens of work that we focus on, which is employment for those marginalized workers. We're really excited to see included in CEJA. So the Clean Jobs Coalition is made up of about 200 climate groups, healthcare professionals, environmental justice champions and advocates, businesses, community leaders, consumer advocates, and faith-based and student organizations. So a very diverse array of organizations are part of the ICJC. The coalition spent many years, approximately 3 years, organizing around CEJA. They held sessions called Listen, Lead, Share, over 100 of those sessions to gather feedback and really dig into the policy ideas that would really support an equitable bill. Collected that information from residents all across Illinois. And the way for CEJA ended on September 15th when Governor J.B. Pritzker signed into law CEJA and creating the most equitable clean jobs bill in the nation. Next slide. And I'm just going to go off video while I talk. It might make my connection much better. So here on this slide, you can see that CEJA is really bold. It really has a comprehensive approach and investments around clean energy and the programs that are contained within it. It will put Illinois on a path to 100% clean energy by 2045, protect public health from pollution, provide just transition for communities historically dependent on dirty fossil fuels, enact tough utility accountability measures, and create jobs and wealth in Illinois' Black and Brown communities. So my organization and the Clean Jobs Coalition really were intentional about how we thought about CEJA. And oftentimes when big bills like CEJA happen, a lot of communities, especially BIPOC communities, are left behind. So you can see more about some of the numbers that are within CEJA. It invests over $80 million per year for workforce and contractor development programs, really focused and targeted in equity communities, achieves a 100% carbon-free sector by 2045. I won't read through all of these. You can see them there on your screen. Provides $380 million a year in new funding to get from 9% renewables, which we have today, to 40% renewable energy by 2030 and 50% renewable energy by 2040. And throughout the bill, it ensures that 40% of the benefits and investments in solar power, electric vehicles, and the grid must go to those equity investment eligible communities and people. So equity was really at the center, not only of the resources that are going towards CEJA, but also in the programming in those components, which we'll talk more about now. Next slide. So as we were working to get CEJA passed, members of the ICJC were really committed on helping to go through that process to pass a bill that was very robust and very comprehensive. We've now shifted our focus from the passage of CEJA, yay, 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 it passed, we won a lot, to now supporting the successful implementation of the act. We want to ensure that the workforce components and resources, those financial resources and programmatic resources, really that were thought about intentionally and centered around equity, remain intact. So our members are keenly aware that the work did not stop once the bill passed, and that was highlighted in many of the discussions that we had, and the importance to stay engaged in the implementation process as those administering agencies roll out those components of the workforce programs and resources. So one of the subcommittees focusing on this area is the Jobs and Economic Justice Subcommittee, and I am on that particular facilitation team for that subcommittee. And within that, the workforce components that we are really prioritizing and wanting to keep our eyes laser focused on are the hubs, the incubators, the accelerated programs. There's a program for returning residents, the barrier reduction program, and the energy transition navigator. So today we'll be talking about the workforce hubs and the role that DCEO, which is the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, plays in that implementation process. Next slide. Thank you. So we know that the climate crisis and systemic racial injustices are inextricably intertwined. So we had to address both of those simultaneously, and the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act did that, it does that. So for underinvested communities, which are oftentimes communities of color, who are the first to suffer negative consequences of pollution, but the last to reap the health and economic benefits, are also the last to reap the economic and health benefits of clean energy. CEJA created a framework for targeting investment and benefits to those communities by creating equity investment eligible communities and equity investment eligible persons, which are, among other criteria, residents of environmental justice communities as created as part of the Solar for All program, or another piece of legislation that was passed, Restore, Reinvest, and Renew, and that's under the cannabis law. So the maps on this page outline the locations of those communities, whether they are an environmental justice community, an R3 community, or potentially both. So we included that language and that guidance in the act. I must admit, there were many conversations within the coalition and through the negotiations process where we wanted to use more race-conscious language. But we were advised, and thankfully so that we wanted to avoid any potential challenges that might create or undermine the equity components within CEJA for the resources, financial resources that were being made and invested, but also to the programmatic parts of CEJA, those workforce development programs that we want to see stood up. So while we wanted to get as close as we could to using, or be very direct in using race-conscious language, we were told we wanted to sort of put in those proxies to prevent any potential challenges to that. And as a family, the ICJC and the various members, there were tensions, and we had good talks about that, and came to the conclusion that we wanted this to be successful, and we opted to use those terms like equity investment eligible communities, equity investment eligible persons, and then also language around the R3 cannabis law proxies as well. Next slide. So here you can see CEJA invests approximately $80 million every year into developing a thriving renewable energy workforce with Black and Brown communities at the forefront. We want those Illinoisans historically shut out of the clean energy economy to be prioritized in bringing an equitable workforce for everyone along. Within that are the Clean Jobs Workforce Network programs, and those are the hubs that I'm going to be providing more context to in just a little bit. So there's about 13 workforce hubs that will be run across the state by community-based organizations to provide clean energy jobs training and a career pipeline for those equity eligible individuals. And those are funded at up to about $21 million per year. The Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity will also be looking to create another 2 hubs. So I think it's a total of 15 workforce hubs across the state by community-based organization. There's also, within the workforce components, there's also a pre-apprenticeship program to help train people in the clean energy sector, construction and building trades. There's that returning residents program, which trains soon to be released people who are you might be currently incarcerated for jobs in the solar and energy efficiency sector. There's also the Energy Transition Barrier Reduction Fund, and that's a very critical piece to supporting people who are oftentimes marginalized and have more complex challenges, where it provides resources for placement or retention to break down those barriers to participating in more intensive training type programs. And the intentionality around that barrier reduction program is different from what we've seen or advocated for in other publicly funded supportive services type programs. So there's language where it could be for someone to get their car repaired, if that is a potential barrier for them to getting employment or retaining employment, which can be destabilizing for folks in these types of programs, or even employ folks once they exit. A great thing, or one thing that we've learned at the Jobs Council, is that barrier reduction programs, really good ones, are really flexible on how they can be accessed and how the time period for which they can be accessed by those individuals needing those types of supportive services and wraparound services. So that's really a critical component. The energy transition navigators are also community-based organizations that can provide education, outreach, and recruitment to those eligible populations to make sure they're taking advantage of workforce development programs. So there's also making sure people are aware of the programs and connecting them to those resources. So thinking of navigation, being an energy transition navigator as a function. So there are some functional parts to being a navigator. And next slide. So continuing along with just the high level overview of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, there's also the Clean Energy Contractor Incubator Programs, which is 13 contractor incubators across the state that will provide training, mentorship, and recruitment opportunities for the small clean energy businesses and contractors. There's the Clean Energy Primes Contractor Accelerator Program for contractors that might be seeking to expand their capacity and step into the role of filling that prime contractor's role on clean energy projects. So helping them build their capacity to move into that ability to be that prime. The accelerated programs offered a structured 5-year program with mentorship, operation support grants, business coaching, and assistance applying for certifications, procurement, and preparing bids. So this is really important for those small businesses or those businesses that don't have those capacities internally. We want to, equity just doesn't start with jobs or end at jobs or with trainees. We also want to give thought and intentionality to businesses. To help address administrative barriers for small clean energy businesses, the Department of Labor will also assist contractors with the prevailing wage payroll, which can create some significant administrative burdens on the back end or internally for those small clean energy businesses, or for any small business, really. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about just who these key agencies are in the components I've just talked about. And here on this slide, you can see that the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity is really responsible for developing most of those equitable workforce and contractor development programs, as well as the energy navigators and the barrier reduction program. The Department of Correction, under their charge, is that returning residents program. Since those individuals are transitioning from incarceration, that will fall under their purview and have to go through. They will be the key administrating agency for that program. One thing to note is that DCEO, Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, it's not mandated that they have a formal rulemaking or procedure for which the programs are developed. So again, where I mentioned the need for eyes on the implementation process is really key now. So since they don't have that formal rulemaking or stakeholder engagement, the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition is really working directly with the state and through those subcommittees like the Jobs and Economic Justice Subcommittee to ensure that these programs are developed and implemented well. So now I just want to, in this slide deck, there are other components that I did include, which is adapted from a larger slide deck that the Clean Jobs Coalition is using to really get the word out about the passage of CEJA. But within this adapted version, I did include other areas that fall under the purview for DCEO. And I believe that this will be shared following this workshop. our lunch and learn today, so you can take a look at those, and I'd be happy to field questions on some of those other areas at a later time. But for now, let's talk about the workforce hubs. So the clean jobs, and we can just stay on this slide and just I'll just speak to the workforce hubs. So the Clean Jobs Workforce Hubs will provide a wide array of workforce development and services. So those hubs that we talked about that will be geographically diverse across the state, 13 different hubs. They will administer programs which include recruitment from diverse communities, skills training, and that can include soft skills training, or employment readiness trainings, oftentimes is the way it's referred. It can also provide technical and vocational training, those wraparound supportive services, as well as placement services for the numerous clean energy career pathways. Many of those career pathways where we see them showing up are in solar, energy efficiency, and clean energy jobs in the building and construction trades. As far as the structure for the workforce hubs, DCEO is required to develop and administer those clean jobs workforce hubs. They are charged with creating a network of community-based organizations geographically distributed across the state. And the hubs will develop partnerships between clean energy job stakeholders, community-based organization, trade groups, labor unions, and other clean energy employers. And ideally, the workforce hubs will also include members of disadvantaged communities. Under DCEO's purview is the charge to select 3 program administrators for the hubs. Their responsibilities would include tracking the performance metrics, including the demographic data on those going into the training programs within the hubs. Those 3 program administrators we would have one for the northern part of the state, the central part of the state, and the southern part of the state. Those program administrators would be partnering with those community-based organizations. They should have really be data informed based on the labor market conditions within their region as well. CEJA also calls for formal partnerships between training programs and employers to help give trainees priority to pre-apprenticeship programs, apprenticeship programs, and employment. One thing I do want to note is that we are talking specifically about the workforce hubs, the clean jobs workforce hubs. There are an additional 3 workforce hubs that fall under a different program for Illinois Works, and that is more labor focused, which we won't be talking about today. Within the workforce hubs, we advocated for the creation of robust education training. That includes guidance for training on specific industry skills, basic reading and math, because sometimes that presents a barrier for folks, or they need some adult basic education before they can go into more intensive programs like an apprenticeship program. So they might need some basic math and readiness skills. So those supports can be provided within the workforce hubs. And career readiness supports. The workforce hubs also include just transition policies, specifically supporting displaced energy workers. So as some of the locations come off the grid that are emitting fossil fuels and coal, those displaced energy workers will need supports as well. So some of the supports for them include tuition support in those community areas, thoughtfulness around tax revenue replacement, business tax incentives for communities with closing energy plants. And oftentimes what trainees entering the regular programs will need may resemble some things that displaced energy workers might need. So that could include career counseling, placement, retention and support services, wraparound supports like transportation, childcare assistance, helping them pay for certifications or preparation tests and fees, and any other emergencies that might affect participation or completion of programs. So the Clean Jobs Workforce Hubs ideally would leverage those community-based organizations to ensure that for just transition, those disadvantaged communities and displaced energy workers have dedicated and sustained support to transition and complete their career pipeline in that industry. Now I want to talk a little bit about Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. The Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. So with funding, oftentimes we see funding coming down from the federal government, and then it trickles down to state agencies or local municipalities, and then they disperse the funding. So in most instances for the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, a lot of their funding comes through the federal level, the Department of Labor, and then it will go through different offices within DCEO. The biggest funding or bucket of funding right now that the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity sort of re-grants out is through the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act, and in workforce development is commonly known as WIOA. So that is a large pot of money that comes down through the federal government, goes to DCEO, and then they subgrant that out to different workforce areas. And there's 22 different workforce areas within the state. And that particular funding, which the federal government and Congress appropriates that funding, right now is about $2.9 billion. So while that might seem like a lot of money, it is, let's say that it is, it's been decreasing for many years now. And when you sort of slice and dice the money that is allocated within that specific funding stream for WIOA programs, the touch to the number of people is very small in the state. So within those various 22 workforce areas, they get it's sort of a fixed rate that they get from the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. But within Chicago, we are a local workforce area that is combined. There's not many people that really see the benefits or programs or access the programs with WIOA. On the flip side of that, opportunities within the Clean Energy Jobs Act or Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, we see that that can reach many more people, go into far more communities, especially if those workforce program administrators are really digging into community-based organizations and building those relationships within communities and getting the word out that many more people can access those programs than what has historically been the largest bucket of money that comes through the federal government. Granted, right now, these programs within CEJA are not up and running and subject to appropriations through the General Assembly. All of the programs are basically funded. Many of the ones I've talked about now are funded through funded by ratepayers, and that rate is set by the Illinois General Assembly. So we don't anticipate seeing any of the programs rolling out from what we are hearing from DCEO until maybe early third quarter, fourth quarter of the year. They just need time. Those rates have to be approved. The General Assembly is actually in session right now. And the budget is probably going to happen later. If it doesn't happen in the session, definitely before the last day of May, when they usually make some decisions about appropriations. But back to the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. We were excited to see that DCEO would be the administering agency for these workforce hubs because they do operate that WIOA system. So there is already, in effect, a workforce ecosystem, and that the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act can be complementary to that. There are within that DCEO's purview and the local workforce areas that they allocate funding to, there is already a series of American job centers, and that is a term that is attached to that bucket of funding. So those are considered similar to this workforce hubs where they administer those WIOA programs. Our workforce hubs on the CEJA side can be complementary to those. So DCO already has sort of like an operational guide of administering workforce hub, a network, if you will, of hubs and supportive services and programs. So this doesn't have to be duplicative of that. It can be complementary, but maybe more sectorial focused based on the clean energy sector and the emerging businesses that are happening there. So that is exciting to think about. We also appreciate that the workforce hubs within CEJA have equity components, that terminology that we talked about, equity eligible communities and equity eligible individuals. So that is different than what they operate within in the WIOA system. So while some community areas might have an American Job Center, they might also benefit from having one of these workforce hubs in close proximity. We do also acknowledge within the coalition that some communities may not benefit from having a workforce hub. They might not even have an American Job Center in proximity to them, but those types of gaps are what we want to uncover and talk about in this implementation process and advocate for through administrative advocacy to the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity about filling some of those gaps and what is the connectivity to make sure that communities that don't have one of these workforce hubs don't get forgotten, because they could have, be in need of these types of support. So it will be very important that those administering workforce hub community-based organizations have the capacity to get out there and talk to those gap communities. I'm going to pull up there for a second and see if we have any questions before I talk more about Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity.
We did have people are thinking of questions. Roberto said in the chat, there is a task force looking at reforming or changing the structure of WIOA. Currently, part of the conversation is how to make workforce development more equitable and accessible. Thank you, Roberto. Anybody else want to raise your hand or put something in the chat? We'll give it a second.
And as you're looking at this slide, I would say there are some key timelines that have not happened yet. So part of what we're working on, the Jobs and Economic Justice Subcommittee, is what needs to happen. What is the point of influence that we might be able to gain traction with DCO or sort of push for some of these things to happen and getting status updates.
Yeah, Nicole has a question. You want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. I've heard that in the past DCO is not to be, I don't know how to say it, trusted. I heard that from a former legislator. How confident are you, Angela, about DCO actually carrying through and following through with what is outlined in CEJA? What do we need to do to, I guess, make sure that they are on the ball and that they will follow through?
It's interesting you said that. I think I've heard, I think, there are always concerns when an agency may have a lot of bureaucracy in the way that it administers programs such as these, or is charged with it, especially if there's not an opportunity to engage with stakeholders or have any direct influence in how those programs stand up, right? I think it's critically important to be aware and to let them know that the coalition and even community folks are watching, they're paying attention. I think, I talked about administrative advocacy with those government agencies that are charged with, implementing these laws, but also there's engagement with elected officials. So talking to elected officials about what is coming down the pike and what they are doing to make, what is happening within the community now that CEJA has passed. So, going to your state rep, your state senator, and asking them what is happening and are they involved? Are they aware and connected to what is happening? It's a lot of money. It's a lot of programs that are coming down the pike. So I think not only engaging with the state agencies, but also elected officials.
Does that require like a meeting? A meeting soon with us and on the various subcommittees and DCEO plus the legislators, or
I think as a constituent, you should feel empowered to go to your state legislator and ask them what they're doing around it, what they're doing in relation to CEJA. You should probably see how they voted, or see if they were supportive, not maybe how they voted or signed it, but where they were, is it important to them? And then if there are community-based organizations within your community area or within your region, are they even aware of what's happening? So there's an education component that the coalition, I know on the Jobs and Economic Justice Subcommittee, we've talked about, like, are people even aware what is coming down the pike? Because oftentimes they're not aware, right?
So we do have more questions here. Why don't we take Dawn and then Peter and then Roberto. Nicole, did that answer your question?
Yes.
Great. Dawn, you want to go ahead and take yourself off mute?
Sure. Thank you very much. I don't want to go too far off tangent here, but these are some concerns with DCEO. One is, the time frames. We don't know when they're going to drop. And I've been through the bill, and it talks about, certain things happening in order. So if there are community groups that want to submit a bid for doing a hub, I mean, people are anxious that they're, that some groups may already be reaching out to DCEO, but there is some kind of law now that is passed in Illinois that makes at least ICJC groups anxious about having almost like ex parte communication with DCEO and then being disadvantaged for being able to make a bid. So can you talk anything to what do we know about the time frames? Like once they open things up, how long will groups have to submit a bid for having a hub, in their region or being able to be part of a hub? And then what do we know about transparency with DCEO? Are they really going to meet with the community as CEJA commands? And then what is that juxtaposition with this bill that prevents us reaching out to them if we might be wanting to be part of a hub, and yet at the same time, CEJA saying that they have to work with the community? Mm-hmm. That's a lot. I know that's a lot
to unpack, but we'll try to tackle it. Yeah. Thank you for those questions, Dawn. I think those are valid concerns as it relates to DCEO and not wanting to, engage in conversations with organizations who might be applying. In my experience, the way that they sort of put these things out for bid is it goes through what is called a NOFO, Notice of Opportunity for Funding. And they'll put that up that is disclosed that this RFP or request for proposals is open. That goes up on their website. It's a whole thing about, the application, what community-based organizations or what the descriptions are for providing the services, how you might apply and how to structure your response. So it can be challenging to engage with them if you are a community-based organization who might be interested in those NOFOs or RFP. Usually those are open for a period of time. It may vary, but I highly doubt, and I don't believe I've ever seen DCEO put out a request for proposals or a NOFO, and then the turnaround or the closing period is 30 days out. Usually it may be a little bit longer, like 60 days.
But even that doesn't give much time. And I'm worried if they are already saying, and I've heard also that they do plan on having things up and running by the end of the year. Well, my gosh, they have to appoint administrators for the hubs. They have to do the RFPs. They have to develop the curriculum. There's a lot to do in that amount of time. I just don't want to disadvantage actual groups on the ground that want to be part of the hubs and not just have like community colleges who might be great at this. But, I don't just want it to be the usual people that get to have a say in what this looks like.
I think that's very valid because, as I said, they do have an existing workforce ecosystem of American Job Centers, and that is a whole bunch of hubs that are already existing under WIOA. So we just wouldn't want to see those same program or American Job Center administrators show up on this side of the workforce hubs within CEJA, right? So we wouldn't want them just to like lock in and for community-based organizations to be excluded. So things that we've advocated for, if DCEO does not want to engage in direct dialogue with community-based organization, is providing technical assistance and webinars on how community-based organizations might respond or present themselves in a response in a NOFO or an RFP. So that is one thing that I know that they've done. We've seen them do that before for things like the job training and economic development program that they're launching. Another thing that I would say is I want to honor and respect concerns around the timeline when DCEO might be standing these programs up, but we've also seen them get bogged down and delayed in RFP and NOFOs. I recall the one specifically that I'm thinking of now is Illinois Works. When that program, I mean, it was up on DCEO's website, the timeline, they thought it was going to be released was, I think, sometime in late 2020 or early 21. Granted, the pandemic did happen, but I recall that they had to spin that program off into a whole different department. So not within DCEO, there's the Office of Employment and Training, but for this particular program, DCEO created a whole different unit internally under workforce programs to administer that program. So they were delayed. That RFP didn't go out when people were on the ground. Providers were expecting it to go out at least a year. It was delayed for at least a year before they stood that program up. We don't want that to happen around these programs since these are really centered on equity. But again, the bureaucracy with these agencies that administer the programs, it will be critically important to stay involved and engaged as a coalition for those subcommittee members and community-based organizations. So I think part of the advocacy and opportunity for jobs and economic justice members is not just looking at DCEO trying to sort of influence DCEO. It's probably also mobilizing those community-based organizations and getting them to amplify the message of like, hey, what is happening? What is the delay? How can you, why is this not advancing? So, you know, sort of at CJC, sometimes we call ourselves agitators. And I think we really want to own being an agitator, especially for this. The Climate and Equitable Jobs Act has too many workforce programs and intentional equity components for us to just leave it to chance.
Amen.
There's,
Yes.
you know, we may have to convene, you know, mobilize community-based organizations in that education piece that I mentioned. You know, if they don't know what's coming, how do they know what to advocate for and how to amplify it or agitate?
Thanks, Angela. Yeah, we've got our work cut out.
I think many of the subcommittees that are focused within the, and I know there are other people who might not be associated with ICJC on this call, but I think many of the subcommittees need to give thought to that. Like whoever the administrating agencies are for their various components, like what is the strategy and how do you get the word out outside of your subcommittee members for who's the intended audience to reap the benefits of those components and how do you engage them? I'm sorry, Jen, there's a stack going.
Oh. Yep, I'm sorry. I had Peter and Roberto. So Peter, you want to ask that question then Roberto?
Sure. Thanks, Angela. In a way, I think you may have answered most of my question, but let me highlight the legislative session ends relatively early this year. What you mentioned about DCEO, you know, in terms of the dispersal of funds and so forth, is going to be perhaps as late as the end of Q3.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, my concern is how does one keep up the momentum with legislators who are already out of session, as well as what can be done, if anything, with DCEO, considering that they can be non-responsive. But there's that, what I call a so-called gap of about 6 months,
Yes.
as much as 6 months. And I understand what you said about mobilizing the communities. So is this really okay, we don't know yet and we're trying to figure it out, or am I just not getting it?
Thanks for your question, Peter. So I mentioned that I'm on the Jobs and Economic Justice Subcommittee, and it does feel like we are in this hurry up and wait limbo, time warp with when things might be rolling out. I would not think that DCO would be looking to, like, once the legislative session has ended, that they would be in a space to release a NOFO, my apologies, immediately. I think they would be time challenged. Some other things that are running on a related and somewhat parallel track are the conversations that the state is having around equity and the workforce development ecosystem. So right now within the state, the Illinois Workforce Innovation Board, which sort of WIOA falls under their purview, they're running the Equity Task Force. And the governor's office also has the Governor's Workforce and Equity and Access Commission, which is looking at the workforce ecosystem and potentially combining state agents, workforce programs that exist under state agencies. So there is a lot that's happening that seems related, that are related to equity. From those two different efforts will come out at the end of those. Both the commission and the task force are wrapping up by May. They have to deliver a report to the governor's office, the General Assembly, with recommendations. While those are not related to funding for CEJA, the equity conversations, there may be implications in those equity conversations and those recommendations. So I think DCEO has some other concerns going on as well with what might come out of those reports and the recommendations and what happens there.
Well, and then
Sounds very encouraging. Thank you.
and I just had Roberto was the last person on the stack.
First of all, it's great to see a lot of people here. Angela, you kind of beat me to my point with the workforce equity commission that JB Pritzker's convened. But I like really like speaking to Nicole's point, like a lot of our people have bad experiences and mistrust with workforce development. And I don't think this group's going to go down that path. I think that it's going to be better. But I think on Angela's point is we can learn something from this access and equity conversation that's happening as we shape the rollout of these green jobs. This is the future. We need to prepare for it. We need to get involved and help shape this as it's rolled out. So I just want to say, we're in a lot of the collar counties. We're a part of the equity and access conversation. Our executive director, Oswaldo Alvarez, is a part of that committee. And we consider us a friend and partner in how to get the Black and brown workforce in these green jobs. We're very excited about that idea, and would love to have more conversations on how to really shape this so that this really works for communities that need these jobs and can benefit from them while we clean up our communities from environmental pollution.
Thank you for mentioning that. And I mentioned DCEO and how they administer programs under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act. So there's 22 different workforce area. Each one has a workforce board. So that might be another area or another entity that you might reach out to, finding out which organization or who is the administrator for the workforce board in your community area. And you can go on to, maybe I'll find a link and send it to Jen after this. It had not occurred to me. Is your workforce board aware of what's happening? Are they involved in the conversations at the state level? Because the four partners that sit at the table for WIOA services are the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, the Illinois Community College District, Illinois Department of Human Services, and Department of IDES. So IDHS and IDES. So talking to those state agencies, specifically your local workforce board, or community colleges in your area, if you don't have those relationships, and finding out what they know. Are they engaged in the process of what's happening or coming down the pipe with CEJA? Or they might be pursuing those opportunities. And if it's a community college, are they tapping into, or your workforce board, are they talking to community-based organizations? Or is that something you might encourage them to do? How might you help influence that in your local area? So, I know we're focused maybe on the access points at the state level, but it might be starting more locally in your area, in those agencies that would have a vested interest. in these programs coming. So the workforce boards, community colleges, those types of things. Did I miss
So
something?
we only have maybe like 4 minutes left. Do you want me to go to a particular slide, Angela?
Oh, no, this inclusive financing, I included these slides just to show that even though inclusive financing is a different subcommittee outside of the Jobs and Economic Justice subcommittee, and while the hubs don't fall under their purview or things that they might be prioritizing, you can see here on this slide how there is definite overlap and connectivity in these programs, and how as a coalition, it's important for us to collaborate and think about how these things connect. So the jobs and environmental justice programs, and some of the things that fall under inclusive financing, they are administered by DCEO as well, but there's a different process than what will happen for the workforce hubs. But the connectivity is why I included these slides, just so you have these, which I'm sure everyone on this call does. The equitable energy upgrade programs. Let's go to the next slide. I'm not sure where it is, that shows who the key agencies and policy venues are. So you can see that DCEO shows up again here under inclusive financing, administering the jobs and environmental justice grant programs, and the seed funding. Some key timelines for them as well. So it's not lost on us that there are a lot of moving parts, but I think it's also important to keep our fingers on the connectivity for these programs. And if that, to be calling that out when opportunities present themselves with DCEO and these administering agencies, that they are aware that, hey, we want you to be aware, because we don't want any business, any community, any individual to fall through the cracks or to miss these opportunities. That is critically important. Let's see if there was something else in the chat. Just transition. I talked a little bit about the just transition programs for displaced energy workers, and how there's opportunity for them, specific supports to them. An interesting thing about the supports for displaced energy workers is I remember having a conversation with someone, and I at the state level, who said, why are you all advocating for so many robust supports for displaced energy workers when within WIOA they have, trade assistant adjustments and extended, programs and supports for people who are displaced. But we wanted to, within CEJA, we wanted to be very intentional about the connectivity to this particular sector, more so than WIOA type programs and or services, if that makes sense.
I'm not sure. Do you want me to end? So we are at the last minute. I think maybe do we just want to close here?
I think so. I mean, my email address is angela@cjc.net. Feel free to reach out. If you are participating in any of those subcommittees, as I mentioned, I am on the Jobs and Economic Justice Subcommittee. We would welcome opportunity collaborating with other subcommittee members and giving thought to the connectivity pieces.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Angela. And if folks have questions, feel free to reach out. And we did record this, so we are going to put it on YouTube probably today. And folks can check it out and learn more. And just thank you so much, Angela, for not only this, but everything you're giving to this work. It's just so awesome. So thanks everybody for joining.
Thanks everyone.
Thank
Enjoy
you.
the rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.